Thank you for joining us for 3Bs on the Law podcast, hosted by Trisha Barita, Camille Canali, and Susan Dawson. Disclaimer, this podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only, not meant to provide legal advice, and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Also remember, laws change or they differ by jurisdiction, so this is not a substitute for seeking legal counsel in your jurisdiction on the current law applicable to you.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of 3Bs on the Law. As many of you probably have questions about COVID-19 testing, we have questions too, and guess what? Dr. Ayn, our guest today, has the answers for us. We're really excited for Dr. Kurlich. She's an independent owner and president of ArcPoint Labs and I know I'm going to butcher this name, Schaumburg. ArcPoint Labs is a nationally recognized leader in drug, alcohol, clinical wellness, and DNA testing for businesses and individuals alike. They've been at the forefront of offering COVID-19 testing options since the early stages of the pandemic. And despite the fact that our Illinois bee, Susan, couldn't be here with us, she arranged to have her good friend, Dr. Ayn, come on to join us. So without further ado, Dr. Ayn, welcome.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming today. And as I said, we have lots of questions.
Thank you for having me.
We're super excited to have you, but I think the best place to start is always at the beginning, because I know there's multiple types of testing. There's testing for actual positive virus, and then there's antibody testing, right?
Correct.
So tell us about the actual tests for the virus itself first.
Okay, so there are actually two types of tests right now that will tell you whether or not you have the virus. And the first is the one that has been around for a while now, and that's the PCR test. The PCR test tests for the genetic material of the virus. So it's testing for RNA. And if you have the RNA for the virus, then you have the virus, but what you don't know is if you're still infectious. Right, so you can have the virus, you can have the RNA present and no longer be infectious. The other test is an antigen test. This is a little bit newer test. I think the first one was received its emergency use authorization in May, and then a second one just recently, I think at the beginning of this month, received their emergency use authorization. So there's only two manufacturers right now making that test, and that is the antigen test. So that an antigen is a protein that's attached to the virus. So this test, the antigen test, is testing for that protein or pieces of that protein. And so if you have the pieces of that protein, then you have the virus and are likely infectious at that time as well. If you don't have the protein, then you're no longer infectious and no longer have the virus. Now, the difference between those tests is that the PCR test tends to be more accurate depending on the manufacturer that you're using, while the antigen test is a rapid test, and so it's not quite as accurate. So it has less sensitivity, and you could get false negatives with the antigen test. But so those are two different types of testing. The antigen test is a rapid test, and so really results come back in about 20 minutes. And then the PCR test, there are some rapid PCR tests. They also tend not to be as accurate as a lab-based PCR test. And results turnaround times are just really variable on the PCR test. It really depends on the lab that's being used.
So let me ask one follow-up question about the PCR test. Can you test positive for the RNA but not be infectious?
You can, because the RNA can still be, if it's no longer infectious, but still in the system, in your system. So you could.
So particularly if you're an employer, if the test comes back positive, how do you know whether the person's still infectious or not, or is there just not a way to tell?
Yeah, it's really difficult to know. And so, and there's so much information out there, some good, some not so good. And really the science isn't there yet to give us all the answers. So typically, right, if you tested positive, you're getting another PCR test to see if you test negative. But there are those cases we don't have a good sense right now of the percentage of the population that continues to test positive after, say, 2 weeks. And we've heard of cases where somebody's testing positive for multiple weeks, so 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 weeks after they had their first positive test. There's not really a good way to determine, are they still infectious at that point. You could potentially do an antigen test, but again, if you get a negative, it's not as accurate as the PCR test. So you have to kind of take all of those things into consideration. If the person no longer has symptoms, they've recovered and are getting a positive viral test, but a negative antigen test, that's something that could be taken into consideration, that they don't have the protein in their system. But again, it's not as sensitive of a test, so you could get some false negatives from the antigen test. But telling whether someone's infectious or not with the PCR test, that's the problem.
Gotcha. And I know Susan's here, so I'm going to bring her in real quick and add her in. Welcome, Susan.
Hi, sorry, everybody. Internet issues. Yay, fun.
But I want to make the best use of Dr. Ann's time, so I'm going to let Tricia, I know she had questions about the antibody testing.
Yeah, just before we get in that, I just was wondering, Dr. Ayn, if you could kind of explain, just in the big picture scheme of things, this, COVID-19 wasn't really on the radar of the general lawyer, obviously, last fall. Here we are, they're inundated with information. You're talking about these different types of testing and stuff. In the span of time that, the development for this test has occurred, is this a really fast development for testing? And is that why we're still kind of seeing the science, sort of shift and move and change?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We're kind of like building the bridge while we're on it, right? So in this case, there's a lot that's still unknown about the virus, even the testing. In the beginning, a couple months ago, there were so many questions. Is this a good test? Is it a bad test? And there weren't many answers. So I would say it took a couple of months for FDA to even evaluate all the different types of testing out there to give an emergency use authorization to. They allowed some testing to occur before there was an emergency use authorization because the situation was so dire, but there wasn't a good time frame, right? We didn't have the time. They didn't have the time to actually evaluate all those test kits that were out there. So I'd say for antibody testing, they're way further down the road now than they were just a couple months ago. Even for the viral test, and now there's antigen testing, there's neutralizing antibody testing. So we're going to keep seeing more developments. We're going to keep seeing the science come out and the thinking around the virus, how to deal with it. The testing is going to change as the science develops. So we're really in that process of building the bridge while we're on it.
I like that. That kind of that makes sense to me. I'm not a scientist person, but building the bridge while we're on it, that sounds like the situation we're in, frankly.
It is. Yeah.
The antibody test that you bring up there. So I don't want to, for anyone who's non-sciencey like me, and the fact that you use non-sciencey probably is exactly why I'm non-science. But when you say antigen, clearly you're not talking about the antibody test. We're talking about two different things here. The antigen test that you're talking about is one of your pieces of your positive test. The antibody test, the EOC doesn't want employers relying on to return people back to work. They've openly said that at the point we're at with the science right now. Can you kind of explain why that is? Because I know a lot of people got real excited about those antibody tests. Some people were like, I know I have these antibodies. So they went and got tested, I have a friend who went and got tested and he tested positive for them and negative, 2 different places. So what's the reliability of this? What is this antibody test about?
Yeah, so the antibody test, there's 2 different ones, but the kind of one that's been around for a while is either looking at IgM or IgA and IgG or just IgG. So those are markers that will tell you, have you been exposed to the virus in the past? It doesn't tell you whether or not you're infectious right now, right? It doesn't tell you whether you have the virus right now. And that's the reason it's not a good test for return to work, because you might have had the virus in the past. Yes, you have the antibodies or you don't have the antibodies, but if you do, we don't know how long those antibodies stick around for, and we don't know if you can become infectious again. That's again where that science is still developing. And so that's why it's not a good test for return to work. If you're returning to work, you want to know, are you still infectious? Do you still have the virus right now? So that's where that comes from. With getting a positive test at one place, a negative test at the other place, all these antibody tests have different limits of detection, right? A different limit of how it's not about accuracy, it's how much antibodies in the system, like the level of antibody in the system, and whether or not it can be detected. And not only that, but it takes time for your body to develop antibodies. So if you just tested positive or you were just sick and you come in to get an antibody test 2 or 3 days later, it's not enough time for the antibodies to develop in high enough concentration to test positive. So you could get a false negative if you come too soon. So for antibody testing, you should probably be about 2 weeks after symptoms or 2 weeks after you were ill. So just to ensure that you're not getting a false negative because you came in too soon. Does that help?
Yeah, that does help. And I know, a lot of people, would like the antibodies and they're trying to figure out, if they have to suffer through COVID, did they get those, treasured antibodies? So thanks for that. That is
Right.
And I actually have one follow-up question to that before we leave, and then I'll let Susan ask her questions. I know I love the science stuff, so I always have questions. But I know before we got started today, when we were talking, you said that there's a new antibody test, and it can actually tell you how much of the antibodies you have. Can you tell us about that?
It's not a concentration. It doesn't tell you a concentration. What it will tell you is whether or not you have immunity. So the previous antibody test we were talking about tells you whether or not you were exposed in the past. The neutralizing antibody test will tell you, do you have immunity or not? And how it presents those results is as I'm not thinking of the word right now, I apologize, but it's a percentage of inhibition. That's what I'm thinking of. So it's a percent of inhibition. So what percent so they take your blood sample and then they throw the virus against your blood sample and see what percent of the virus does not react, like you're not reacting there. So if you have 80% to 100%, then you're inhibiting the virus 80% to 100%. So you've got a really good immune response. If you're at less than 20%, that's considered a negative test. And so you have different categories in there, 20 to 40%, 40 to 60%, 60 to 80 to 100%. And so that'll give you an idea of your immune response to this virus.
And so once if you have that test, and let's say you're 100% naturally immune to the coronavirus, which believe me, I would run out and get tested now if I thought that. But can it differentiate between whether you have developed those antibodies as a result of fighting the disease itself, or whether you have those natural immunity?
No, so you would have to get like the IgG, IgM test to know were you exposed in the past versus you have some sort of natural defense against the virus. So it's not so simple. We also don't know at this point if you do have a neutralizing antibodies. If you are positive, meaning you have some level of protection, some level of immunity, we don't know how long that's going to last. That's again, it's all too new.
Okay, now Susan, I'll let you talk.
Well,
She's just going to take over, Susan.
Time, so that's okay. Usually I'm hogging up the whole podcast, so this was good for me, right? I have to sit and listen. I was just curious, though, to follow up with that. One other thing that we're hearing in the news is there isn't kind of any rhyme or reason to how you're responding to it, as opposed to people who have in the beginning, we were hearing as employment lawyers, we were hearing if someone has diabetes or if someone has this ailment or that ailment, they're at higher risk. And so they should, there's going to be, the doctor will self-quarantine them or what have you. We might have to, from a disability perspective, give them more accommodations. But what I'm hearing is, and tell me if I'm not correct here, that none of these tests are going to tell you how you're going to react to the virus, right? So now we're hearing people that they're saying they were perfectly healthy. There was no reason for them and they became terribly sick or they died, right? we don't have any tests that would give you any kind of anticipation on how you will fare?
So the only one is potentially the neutralizing antibody test, right? Because that'll tell you if you're below 20%, you have no idea how you're going to react to that, to the virus itself. But if you're positive and you have some level of immunity, then that tells you have some level of protection. And so the higher the level of protection, the higher level of immunity. So that'll give you some indication, but yeah, there's not a hard and fast, hey, here's the test that's going to tell you you're not going to get sick or you are going to get sick, right?
Or you're going to get sick, but you're not going to be horribly, horribly sick.
Right. Or you might get it, but you're going to be asymptomatic.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there's not a good way to determine that at this point.
So with all of the different amount of tests that we have out there today, what are businesses, what's the recommendation to businesses? So let's say a business had a COVID outbreak, or they had someone call and say, I was there yesterday and I've just tested positive. And the business, they say, okay, we want to make sure all of our employees get tested, or want to make sure that everyone's safe. What is the recommendation? I know you and I have talked previously, and I was like, oh, they should all get the antibody test. And you were saying that might not be the right approach. What would you recommend?
Yeah, so that's, we touched on this a little bit earlier, either the PCR test or the antigen test. So the antigen test is something that it's rapid. So you get a response, you get your result in about 20 minutes. The PCR test, there are some rapid PCR tests, not as accurate as a lab-based PCR test. And some of the PCR tests, depending on the lab you go to, the timelines are much longer. So, and some labs like ours, we can get them back usually in 24 to 48 hours. Some labs are 7 to 14 days, and then you're kind of like, well, if I have to quarantine for that long anyway, what's the point? So really, it's just understanding your local labs, what's available to you. What are your options from the local labs around you? Is the antigen test available yet in your area? Is there a lab that has it? Is there a rapid PCR test near you? Or, what are the timelines for a PCR test? But yeah, you don't want the antibody test if you're looking at coming back to work. It's going to be much better to do a test that will tell you whether or not someone currently has the virus or is infectious. It doesn't really tell you if they're infectious, but it'll tell you do they currently have the virus in their system?
Right. So of the tests we're talking about, we've got an antibody test, we've got a variety of tests to find out if you have the virus active in your system, and then there's the immunity test. And so of those three tests, we're not talking about availability necessarily or how long the turnaround is. Really, what employers should be looking for is who is positive first, right? Who has the virus first?
Right. So, and whether they're asymptomatic or not, right? If they have symptoms, they just should be quarantining anyway. But if they don't have symptoms, if they were exposed or potentially exposed, and that's the other thing. So if you had somebody test positive and they were around other people in the workplace, you want to wait about 48 hours before testing them. So 48 to 72 hours to allow the virus to develop enough. Otherwise, you could get a false negative for even the PCR test because you haven't given it enough time to develop. So if others were exposed, you don't want to test them. And so you might be just sending them home for a couple days and then go get them tested to see if they, if they're sick, if they get sick, right, you're pulling them from the workplace. But if they're not, they could still be asymptomatic positive and infect others at work. So that's the scenario that you want to avoid.
Another issue that employers are having are employees traveling to hotspots and then they have to come back and quarantine. They have no symptoms. They just went to Florida for vacation and came back. And there's really not yet a test that we can say, okay, you just got back from Florida, go get this test, and then you don't have to quarantine for 14 days, right? That's still on
that is, you can do that. And we have people coming in to do that. So PCR or antigen test. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So and you might want to wait the 48 hours after landing, right? If you just came from a hotspot, and not everybody on that plane had a negative test when they got on that plane, and you might want to quarantine yourself for the 48 hours and then get that test done. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it sure does. And thank you so much for joining us today. I love the sciencey stuff, as Trisha says. I could talk to you for all day, but I know you have to go. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to have you back again soon.
We will.
Well, thanks for having me.
We will
All
have
right,
you
take care
back.
now.
Thank you.
Ladies, she's so fantastic. I'm so
She
happy,
is.
Susan,
Oh my gosh.
for her to come. I have so many more questions.
Oh, we'll have her back. There's so many more things we could talk to her about, non-COVID related. I mean, there are other things to test for, right?
There are. All right. Well, we'll have to have her on for drug and alcohol.
Yeah.
For employers.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you for joining us today on 3Bs on the Law, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you for joining us on today's podcast of 3Bs on the Law. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast. We also welcome any comments. If you'd like to get in touch with us or suggest a future topic, you can email us at 3THREEBsonthelaw@gmail.com. And because we're lawyers, we need to remind you that this podcast is not meant to provide you with legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.